Hey there, it has been a while since I've made a video. I've just been going through the most absurd spiritual transformations as of late. Yeah, I've just been going through a really transformative period as of late with my meditation and just spirituality in general. And I woke up this morning with an intuition, an urge to share a message about progress on the meditative path, on this path of meditation, and what it really means. You know, one of the things that I've really started to learn over the last couple of months is that this practice in particular of meditation, and then more generally spirituality, is such an immense journey. Like, it is the ultimate hero's journey. And I think that I've underestimated just how deeply this stuff goes, like how much work there really is to do. There are just layers and layers and layers of conditioning and mind that are constructed around this very sticky and stagnant and consistent feeling sense of self that is actually not really who we are at the deepest level. But as we work through this stuff, we start to learn more and more about who we are at this individual human level. And there's just so much material to overcome and work through and embody and heal from. And that's just the first thing that I would like to talk about in terms of progress on the meditative journey. We have to understand that, like, there is a lot to work through. And when we take on this path, when we take on practice that is oriented in a way that's centered around spiritual enlightenment or self-actualization, becoming the best version of ourselves as possible, understanding reality at the deepest level, transcending suffering, finding a happiness that is independent of condition, all of these things that the words liberation or enlightenment might mean, when we center our practice around this direction, we just have to always keep in mind that it is a lifetime of work. And so, for myself, just speaking from my own personal experience, I've only been serious about this path for the last 3 years. Back in 2018, January, I had a New Year's resolution to meditate an hour a day, and I managed to do that for the past 3 years. I've managed to do that for the past 3 years, rather. And even more recently, the past 6 months, I've bumped that up to 2 hours a day of formal practice, which I'll need to make a video on. That's a whole other can of worms that I could talk about. But suffice to say that I consider it to be pretty serious for all intents and purposes. Like, I feel like I've committed fairly rigorously to this path. And even still, in a lot of ways, I feel like I have just begun. And I want to be honest about that any perspective that I have on this path is coming from the perspective of a beginner, but albeit a beginner who goes very hard at this, but a beginner nonetheless. So just keep in mind that that's where my perspective is coming from. I'm not a master by any means, but I do feel like I have a perspective that is worth sharing. And part of that perspective is, look, man, just always keep in mind that this is a lifelong path. That who knows where we will be after 10 years of practice, never mind 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, a lifetime of practice. I mean, there's no telling where we will be, but it's hard for the human mind to think that far out, to conceptualize that far into the future. And typically when we do that, our concepts of the future are wildly inaccurate and totally not what the future is going to end up being anyways. So just rest in that present moment and understand that we have to be patient on this path. That's the first thing that I wanted to share. When I did my first retreat, one of the things that the teacher at the retreat, Shinzen Young, by the way, if you don't know who that is, you need to Google him or look him up on YouTube. He's got a lot of great content and videos. He's super cool and an amazing meditation teacher. But anyways, one of the things that he kept talking about and bringing up on this retreat was this idea that subtle is significant. Now, this was really the first time I had heard this term, subtle is significant. And it's not something that I really related to. My background with spirituality is taking drugs. That's what got me started on the path. I was exploring marijuana or cannabis, smoking and getting high every single day. And from that state of consciousness, from that state of being high and kind of being blissed out on weed, I would contemplate about the nature of experience and reality and perception. I would do my morning meditations, I would go to school, and then when I would get home, I would light up a bowl and get high. And that was sort of just the way that I participated in my own spirituality. The thing about drug use and the thing about weed or even psychedelics, as I would later come to find out, and as I'm sure many of you guys might be aware of as well, there's nothing subtle about these experiences at all. They're actually quite absurd, and the implications of them are also absurd because of how like grandiose and colossal and the magnitude of the experience itself, the magnitude of the shift that they have on our perceptive experience. And so coming from that perspective, these types of shifts in state of consciousness were not subtle, but they were significant. And in my mind, that's what I was sort of looking for out of my meditation. Even though I knew like meditation's not supposed to be about, you know, like tripping balls or whatever, in the background of my mind, like I wanted it to be or induce this massive state change, just like the drugs were doing. But the actuality of meditation is that it is a subtle thing. And so going back to this phrase, subtle is significant, this is something that really starts to open up on this path as we progress and as we learn more about the practice and about ourselves, which is that even the subtlest shifts in our experience can be astronomical and significant. And sometimes, even when we're making massive progress on the path, at the surface, we might not be able to pick up on it because not much has changed. Perhaps we're still operating more or less the same way, and perhaps our experience hasn't had any sort of dramatic shift in any way, shape, or form. But when we investigate deeply, when we really pay attention, we can see that there has been actually a significant change in the way that we relate to ourselves or perhaps others. And as we progress and get deeper on this path, the subtle shifts that are always occurring as we're both on the mat meditating, so the way that we interpret the meditative experience or the meditative practice, but also the way that the practice transforms our lives in these subtle yet significant ways, starts to increase in a sense. We start to sensitize our ability to pick on just how significant these changes are. So I say all this to basically say that if you are beginning on this path, it might not seem like deep change is going on. It might not feel like much is changing at all as the weeks go on, as the months go on, even as the years go on. But you just have to trust that as you work through this phase of practice, as you are continuing to show up on the mat on a daily basis, as you start going on retreats, which I highly recommend you start going on a retreat at least once a year. I think that's a really good minimum amount. As we start to do this, the significance of these shifts in consciousness and these shifts of our perceptive experience, the way that we relate to the world, start to increase in their significance. So basically, I just say all that as a reminder or as a pointer that subtle is significant, and subtle starts to become more significant even than significant shifts in experience. So for example, I can just kind of relate this back to drugs, back to weed. I've actually gotten to a point where the subtle peace and ease of my sober state of consciousness is more pleasurable than using a drug to get high. So like if I were to smoke weed now, that actually takes away from my experience. I don't like the way that it affects my nervous system anymore. Whereas when I first started out on this path, that wasn't the case. Like a drug like alcohol or weed that induces sort of these artificial chemical highs of bliss, those felt more powerful. And so that's just kind of one example of how this shift has played out. One of the most peculiar facets of this path and the way that it unfolds and progresses is that it's very cyclical or spiral-like in nature. It doesn't just, it's not like we start at A and move to point B in a straight line. It's not linear in the way that it unfolds. In fact, if we were to somehow track the way that experience and transformation and raising our consciousness unfolds, it is very cyclical. It is like like I said, like a spiral. And so what I mean by that is like we can have moments where like we are just having these amazing, blissful, very mystical like states while we're meditating, and then almost just spontaneously one day it'll just shift and we'll sink into sort of this like this ego backlash or dark night of the soul-esque state where suddenly we're like super depressed, we're super anxious, we start self-sabotaging. Behavioral patterns that we thought we worked through are suddenly like just reasserting themselves. Like a lot can just happen where we start to feel much more contracted and constricted and separate rather than open and spacious, fluid, formless, mystical, all these types of things. We can spiral back into a state that we thought we were done with. And this is a really important point to understand, especially for people who are newer on the path. This is something that I didn't understand for a long time. And if we don't understand that this is the nature of how the nervous system adapts to the exposure of meditation, it can oftentimes make us feel like we're doing something wrong, even though our practice might be on point and all we had to do, or all we have to do, is to just keep going, keep digging deeper into the technique that we're using or into the practice that we're participating in. But we can start to doubt ourselves, even though there's no need to do that at all. Or we might start to doubt the path. We might start to think like, damn, like this whole meditation thing is just not for me. And we might just quit, even though we were like right on track to have a huge breakthrough. Sometimes it's kind of the opposite. We can slowly be practicing over the course of a month even, and every single day over the course of that month, it starts to get worse. Like our sits just start to, like our minds start to get more active. We start to not really be able to track and feel the sensations of our body. We start to feel very just like head oriented and, like I said before, like separate and egoic. And it just gets worse over the course of that month. And then spontaneously, like we sit down and then just like boom, like this massive transformation happens and suddenly we are blissed out and feeling one with the universe. These types of cyclical, spiraling, unpredictable state changes that occur over the course of the meditative path have to be honored and acknowledged and expected. Then I think it's important to get familiar and comfortable feeling the tension between these types of ebbs and flows of practice, these highs, these sort of peak experiences, but then working through the purification process of dismantling our, for lack of a better word, like our wounded self, like the self that was drawn to the practice of meditation in the first place, the feeling of being a separate individual, isolated being in this universe, even though from the highest perspective, we are literally connected with everything. So we have to be ready and willing and able to face this non-linearity of the meditative path. And the other thing that is worth mentioning about meditation is that there is an exponential takeoff with the way that it unfolds, the way that we start to transform. Another thing, going back to my retreat, we would have interviews with the meditation teacher. And I thankfully was able to have an interview with Shinzen. And I asked him about, like, what is this going to look like in 10 years? Like, what am I really getting myself into? You know, I've only been doing it for 3 years. So if I want to get out, I can go on ahead and get out before it gets too crazy. And basically what he told me was, he explained that at some point, the results of the individual just take off in an exponential growth curve. That for some people, it might take a year if they're particularly gifted and they just kind of have the karmic design or destiny to be good at meditation. And for others, it might take them, 10 years if they're a little bit less gifted. He said, though, that inevitably, if people persist with their daily practice, if they have a very solid daily practice, doing 45 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that, if they're going on a retreat, at least, once a year or more, if they are focused on having mindfulness and developing this practice and integrating it in their daily lives, that if you have those pillars, inevitably there is an exponential takeoff. And this is coming from someone who's been teaching meditation for over 40 years. So I'm inclined to trust his opinion or his perspective. And this is really interesting because in a sense, it does track with my own path. But this is something that I've noticed that Shinzen wasn't talking about, which is that, like I haven't hit this major like exponential growth curve per se that he was talking about, takes 1 to 10 years. But what I've noticed is that in the microcosm of practice, there are exponential watershed moments with our practice where we just spontaneously launch into levels of consciousness that are completely foreign or were completely foreign until we hit that watershed, and suddenly we're like regularly feeling one with the universe, or we might be sitting down to meditate and it's like we're microdosing on psychedelics or something like that. Like we just hit these layers, break through these traumas, or our minds unify in such a way that suddenly our ability to concentrate and be present and be mindful is exponentially higher than what it was a week or two ago. And so as we work through, again, going back to this idea of the non-linearity of the meditative path and its progress, the way it progresses, this non-linearity is also further complicated by the fact that there are these watershed moments of exponential increases in ability that sort of arise out of nowhere. A really good metaphor for this might be like, and I can't take credit for this, I didn't think of it. I honestly don't even remember where I heard it from. It could have been just on Reddit or something. Hashtag Buddhism Reddit, it's a great place. Hashtag Meditation Reddit as well, another great resource. But basically, when we're working with the mind, like we do during meditation practice, we can think of it as like the mind has these like tectonic plates underneath the way that it generates our perceptive experience and the way it generates our sense of self. And as we continue to work through the path, these tectonic plates are subtly shifting in the mind. And then just one day, the plates shift in such a way that there's this massive earthquake. And that earthquake would be one of these watershed moments of exponential transformation that happen rather spontaneously. So this is sort of how the meditative path has unfolded for me over the course of these last 3 years at least. Going weeks and months where not much is happening, and then it's just like boom, massive transformation, a massive shift. And then over the long run, there are these like cycles of purification, dark night of the soul symptoms, but there's also these like peak experiences. And part of the path of meditation is being able to find that peace and equanimity as the mind ebbs and flows and flails around at the lack of stimulation that the practice brings on, and the beauty and the wonder that it brings on as well. So we have to have equanimity with everything, and finding that inner peace that is unperturbable. I recently heard a Zen story that I think really helps capture what this last point that I'm trying to communicate is all about. The story goes like this. There was a beginner monk, a new monk who had just joined a Zen monastery, and he's been there for a couple of months, and he's very new to meditation. So he goes up to the Zen master and he asks the Zen master, like, why do you meditate? Why do you meditate? Why do you meditate? And the Zen master tells him, just looks him in the eye and says, no reason. And the Zen monk doesn't really understand. And he's like, well, aren't we meditating because we want to reach enlightenment? Like, isn't that what meditation is all about? And the Zen master kind of pauses and looks at him. And, of course, being the cheeky Zen master that he is in this story, he smiles and just says, no. We meditate because we're enlightened, not the other way around. And I think that story is really interesting, and it's also really telling. I have no idea if it's true or not. It sounds like a Zen story that would be true. But this perspective that there's really nothing to be gained by undergoing this path of meditation, that reality is already perfect the way that it is, that even when we are at our lowest point, like when we're just super selfish, caught in our thought stories, caught in our illusory life stories, our conditioning, our limiting beliefs, our traumas, all the bad stuff that we typically affiliate with the ego, even when we're caught in the middle of all of that, like at the end of the day, at the most existential of perspectives, there is nothing wrong with it. It's just an expression of the whole. It's just an expression of reality. I oftentimes find that this perspective is the deepest, and it's the one that we have to always keep in mind when we start thinking about how things like progress are conceptualized on the path of not only meditation, but just our spiritual journey in general. Like, the idea that there's something to fix, the idea that there's anywhere to go is itself perpetuating a movement across time rather than encouraging the surrender into the present moment, which is where truth resides. You know, you can't get existential absolute truth unless you go traveling to the present moment, which the only way to travel to the present moment is not by traveling anywhere. It's about stopping the travel. It's about stopping all of the activity. And so, like, at times, you know, it can be very difficult not to fall into this pattern of wanting something out of this practice, of wanting things like deep, radical, massive transformation, or healing some sort of wound that we carry inside, or getting some sort of mystical experience. But at the end of the day, truth and happiness, if they are absolute, if they are truly unperturbable, if they are truly if they're ever truly going to be available, they have to come out of something that transcends all states of consciousness, that transcends all states of mind, all states of experience. And when we drop trying to get something out of practice, that's when we start moving into that space. And so even though I actually do think that it's important to talk about how meditation unfolds and how we can transform ourselves and become better versions of ourselves with this practice, at the end of the day, it's equally, if not more important, to understand that there's nothing to gain out of this path. You know, there's nothing to do. Which is something that starts to unfold at deeper and deeper levels as we continue to practice and as we continue to walk this path. And so the last point that I would like to make just about this whole video is that we have to find it within ourselves, the ability to ride this paradoxical beast, which is that on the one hand, massive, radical, just unbelievably beautiful transformation, shifts in experience and states of mind and consciousness are possible with practice. I mean, like, just absurdly significant and beautiful states. Things that are very, very, very available, assuming that we've set practice up in a conducive way. That at that level, it is important, and there is something worth acknowledging, that truth about what this path and practice leads towards. But on the other hand, from the absolute point of view, from the point of view of reality or God or the universe or enlightenment and liberation, there is nothing to gain. Happiness and truth are available right now. They could only be available right now. And unless we have found a truth which transcends all states of mind, all psychedelic states, all mystical experiences, all feeling one or empty or completely infinite, unless you can find something, unless we can find a truth that transcends all of that, we don't have it. We're missing it. We're still missing it. That is what I would like to offer. That is the invitation that I would like to provide. And yet, somehow, some way, this invitation is going to be extended. There is something even deeper, which is that there is this culmination, this synthesis of these two perspectives, that they actually don't compete with one another, even though they might seem to compete with one another on the rational, logical point of view, on that level of mind. From a deeper perspective, they're just two sides to the same coin. And we're actually working towards both simultaneously. So that's all I had to say. I hope that you found this video about the progress of meditation useful. Please comment in the comment section below. Let me know, like, how has meditation progressed for you? And again, I like to say this, but by sharing your thoughts or sharing your questions, you're not just helping yourself, but you're also helping anyone who happens to stumble into this video and read the comments. So I am always incredibly grateful and appreciative of of you guys who leave comments. And if you like this video, hit the like button. And if you like the style of content, please subscribe. And I will see you guys in the next video.